Hi there, I'm Mark McMillian, and I'm just thrilled to be starting out on a new project, kind of like a new adventure. I'm going to try to do a series of audio recordings of the blog posts I've been doing over the last 10 years. I have 2 websites with around 700 articles in total. So this is a new effort to make the articles available now in this audio format. My plan is to try to find articles generally on the same subject, 3 articles to each audio show. This first broadcast will be on the subject of angels and miracles that I've experienced in my hometown, Austin, Texas. This first article is about what happened to me here in Austin around 10 years ago. It's called God's Little Miracles, written February 28th, 2013. The article can be found with that title on my website, markmcmillian.com. God's Little Miracles. Do miracles happen? Do angels exist? I'll tell you what happened to me last night. You decide. After my evening's English teaching was finished around 8:30 p.m., I was asked to be the last one out of the building and to lock up. But last night, when I set the automatic alarm and locking, it just didn't work. The door didn't lock. I was alone outside of a building full of expensive equipment located in the midst of a low-income housing project in a high-crime part of my city. I phoned my boss to tell her what had happened. It went to voicemail. I looked around outside the building to see any familiar face from the school or the students. There was no one around except a tall African-American stranger in his 20s talking on his phone 10 yards away. I asked him if he lived in the housing complex or knew who was in charge. He was friendly, but told me he didn't. I basically was at a loss as to what to do. I felt I couldn't just drive off and leave all within the building open to anyone who would wander in overnight. I talked a bit more with the African-American guy, the only person anywhere around. At length, he offered to phone the city emergency number. I ended up explaining things to the police. They told me they could notify the police that patrolled that part of the city that there was a door open, but beyond that, there was nothing they could do. I was really on my own, and it was getting later. I phoned my very elderly parents to tell them why I wasn't there by now and about what had happened. As it got later and later, I introduced myself to the guy who was still there and had made the call for me. He said his name was Dontre. I was counseling with him and asked him what he thought would be an idea. So he said I could try to go to the housing complex office and see if anyone was there. I was getting desperate and I told him I could try that. Dontre said to walk about 50 yards one direction, then go to the far end of that parking lot, turn right, and farther down that way was the office. I headed out, 50 yards in the dark, left turn and another 70 yards, turn right, and as I walked on, I could see the office up ahead. Then I heard a voice. "Hi, Mark." No, it wasn't the audible voice of God. But over on a bench in the dark was one of the teachers who teach in the English school I work at. I nearly dropped my teeth. I went over to her as she was for some reason outside in the very late evening alone on her cell phone. It turns out she lives there at the housing complex. She knew how to get hold of the maintenance guy in order to find some way to lock the building up. She and I walked back to the unlocked door. I'd only been gone barely 5 minutes, but when we got there, Dontre was no longer anywhere to be seen. He'd been there on his cell phone for around 45 minutes right there before that, but then he was gone. So you might say, "Mark, is that all? You call that a miracle? That was just happenstance, a coincidence." Oh yeah? If you'd seen this in a movie, you'd roll your eyes and say, sure, that's so totally unlikely that he's going to meet up with a woman teacher from his school out in the parking lot 200 yards away from the building in a high-crime part of town late at night. For me, it was a real act of God and His love and providence. I was in a fix and felt torn between my responsibility to my parents and my responsibility to see that the building was locked up. So that was one heck of a coincidence that I'd run into one of the main teachers in the school in the late evening so far away from where I'd been. She was able to take over getting the maintenance crew there to safely lock up the school, and I could drive home. And isn't it funny how Dontre just disappeared like that? Angels do that. Okay, I'm not utterly sure he was an angel, but if not, he was sure used of God at that time to really be a help to me. Earlier, when he was still around, I was getting onto the fact that the young man I was talking to was possibly not really a normal human being as he looked to be. So I asked Dontre, "What do you think I should do?" He immediately answered, "You should think about your family. Always put your family first." I'm certain that the Lord miraculously led me last night to get out of a difficult and dangerous situation. As for Dontre, it's like the Bible verse that says, "Don't forget to show kindness to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it." Hebrews 13. And the whole event last night reminds me of another verse about angels. "The angel of the Lord encamps around them that fear God and delivers them." Psalm 34. In the summer of 1969, I had the strongest experience I've ever had. I had what is now called a near-death experience. In my case, an angel didn't carry me to heaven, but the opposite happened. Satan was very nearly allowed to carry me out of my body and into the netherworld, what we call hell. Perhaps I'll do a show about some of the specifics of that event. But the result was that I was absolutely stunned out of my entrenched unbelief and into an astonished newfound belief in the God of the Bible. But I wasn't a Christian yet. I believed in God now, but I really didn't know who Jesus was. I had many events during that time as God was doing a lot in my life to bring me out of the person I was and into what He wanted me to be. Here's one of several miraculous things that happened to me at that time back then. This article is called Lights on the Road, and it can be found on my website with that title. I was just barely 21 years old when this happened to me, here in Austin in October of 1969. Angel Stories, Lights on the Road. It was like being able to go back and see where you died. I recently went back to a country road west of Austin, Texas, where, for all intents and purposes, I really should have died in October of 1969. It's a sad, sobering story of what was truly God's infinite mercy and my depraved wrongdoing. This is another story similar to the ones I wrote earlier, Lucifer and the White Moths, The Radio Miracle, and Don't Ever Ask Again. Those events all happened a few short months earlier in July, August of 1969. And I'll add a note here, I hope to have those articles in this audio format soon. Back to the text. You'd think, after all I experienced, that I'd be a good boy for the next 80 years, but that's not what happened. Like I wrote about in God is Chance, at this time I had a fancy European sports car, which was in every way a real idol for me. After my near-death experience involving drugs in the summer of 1969, I stopped using the strong stuff, but I soon got back to smoking marijuana again. And later that fall, I decided to go out for a joyride with my girlfriend. She and I were smoking marijuana, driving along a winding hill country road just west of Austin at night and listening to Jimi Hendrix on the cassette player. I guess I was thinking, everything's back to normal. In the last month, I'd been reading my Bible, a new thing for me, and praying, but I didn't know who Jesus was. I wasn't saved, and I was still hanging out with my old friends. The car could go very fast, and I liked that. We were driving in an area where there was often a rock wall on one side of the road and a drop-off down a steep hill to the lake on the other. And recently I went back to this place so I could add photos of the actual location. What happened next was this. We were driving down a long straightaway that I knew took a slight turn to the right at the end of it. That's what you can see in picture A. While driving down the straightaway in the dark, probably doing 80 miles an hour, about 135 kilometers an hour, suddenly on the side of the road in the darkness just before the curve, I saw two lights. I recognized that they were supernatural as this was in the middle of nowhere, and I said loudly in my mind, "There's angels here." Almost immediately, I went into the turn. What I didn't calculate in my driving was that the road not only turned to the right, but it also had a dip right there in the road. My car was going so fast that because of the dip, the back end of the car spun around completely backwards, 180 degrees. So the next thing I knew, we were going totally backwards at the same speed I went into the turn. Furiously, I clutched the car, looking behind me into the darkness, applying the brakes, trying to steer the convertible going backwards at high speed on drugs. Utterly miraculously, we came to a stop on a small shoulder of the road, around 100 yards past the turn in the road. I turned off the engine and we sat there. I turned off Jimi Hendrix, and by then all the effects of the marijuana were totally gone. And in the article on my site are photos of this place where before and after the turn's views can be seen. That moment was one of the greatest zeniths or naders of my life. If I ever felt that I didn't deserve to be alive right then, that was the place. After all God had done to save me from death and the devil just a few short months before, there I was back at it again. Sin is not a popular or politically correct word nowadays, but I knew without a doubt that I had sinned and gone back to the ways that had nearly killed me before. I didn't deserve to survive that car mishap. I deserved punishment big time. But God had shown me two angels just a few seconds before that incident who were there to somehow guide that spinning car hurtling backwards through the darkness along that mountainous road so that the car came to a standstill instead of flipping over or going off a cliff. The totally undeserved mercy of God, my willful, sinful self. The revelation of angels to show it was an act of His unearned clemency. We were totally unhurt. The car didn't even have a scratch on it. We drove back to Austin as I was silently in awe, deeply stunned, sobered, and humbled by what had happened. Why had this happened? First, I was not yet a Christian and didn't have the power of salvation to give me the strength to flee temptation and follow Him in a new life. But God evidently had a plan for my life. It wasn't His time or place for me to have a big car wreck, as there were a number of things that kept happening during the fall of 1969, leading up to my meeting some young, radical Jesus people a few months later who led me to receive the Lord. But if I ever have any doubts about where Jeremiah said, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked," Jeremiah 17, then I can think back to my depraved foolishness as I tempted fate and God after He delivered me from death just a few months earlier. His mercy is from everlasting to everlasting. Psalm 103. The angel of the Lord encamps round about them that fear God and delivers them. Psalm 34. One thing about miracles, they are really powerful against unbelief. And that's where I was at, firmly, very firmly entrenched in unbelief. But the Lord sort of brought out His big guns, I guess because He knew that I was actually looking for the truth. This is a miracle that happened to me while I was going to the University of Texas in Austin. It happened before I had the near-death experience. It's called Up Against the Wall, about a little encounter I had with the police who raided my apartment. Up against the wall. Would God do a miracle for an unbeliever, an atheist? Jesus said that God sends the rain on the just and the unjust. He certainly did a miracle for me that kept me out of 2 years of prison at a time when I was really not a believer. Here's what happened. While I was going to the University of Texas in Austin back in the late 60s, I had a nice job, drove a sports car, and I was an atheist. I smoked marijuana from time to time, used psychedelics, and sometimes I sold a little marijuana and psychedelics. I never sold stuff on the streets, just to close friends. But after a while I got a little careless. Friends would come with their friends, people I didn't know. I lived in an efficiency apartment near the campus, and one afternoon I was ironing shirts in my tiny kitchen. Then, kind of out of nowhere, the idea came to me that I really should take my drugs and go put them away somewhere. I hadn't been thinking about that till then, but I stopped ironing my shirts, put several ounces of marijuana and the various pills I had into a paper grocery bag. I was thinking that this would somehow make it look like I was walking around with groceries. I walked out the door of my apartment, and right there was a man on a ladder. That wasn't normal, but I figured he was a repairman. He looked down at me and the paper bag, but I guess he just saw the loaf of bread on top. I walked a few blocks down to Shoal Creek, a well-known place that students and locals go for nature walks. I found a secluded spot, put my drugs underneath a rock, and walked back to my apartment. When I got there, I was surprised because the lights were on inside, and I always turned off the lights when I left. I unlocked the door, and I was completely in shock to have two policemen with drawn guns come out of my bathroom and kitchen yelling at me, "Put your hands up against the wall." They had a search warrant for my apartment. I sat on the sofa while they searched everything. In those days, if the police even found a stem, seeds, or the tiniest butt of a marijuana cigarette, it would virtually guarantee that you'd spend 2 years in Huntsville State Prison, even as a first-time offender. As it turned out, they did find some tiny seeds or stems of marijuana on my carpet. At last they talked to me and said, "We can take you in for what we found here, the seeds and the stems. But we didn't find what the search warrant was written for. So if we take this to a grand jury, we won't win. But we're watching you." So they left. And I sat there. Did I praise God? Did I say, "Thank you, Jesus"? No. I was a hardened atheist. I believed in nothing other than evolution, chance, and the law of averages. This is what I wrote about in God is Chance. I was convinced that that's all there was. I can tell you, things like this can really be tough on atheists. All I was really thinking about was, why did I get that idea right then when I was ironing shirts to go put my dope away? I hadn't thought about that before then. The guy on the ladder outside my apartment, almost certainly a police stakeout. He looked at the bag of drugs but saw the loaf of bread and didn't do anything. The time between when I left my apartment and when I got back was around 20 minutes. I missed going to prison for 2 years by 20 minutes. It was like I'd been run over by a big truck, but somehow I ended up between the wheels. That's how I thought about it afterwards. So next Sunday I was in church, right? Suit and tie, big haircut, and had really changed my ways. Not at all. I was deeply hardened through the deceitfulness of sin, Hebrews 3. Though mercy be shown to the wicked, yet he will not learn righteousness, Isaiah 26. I guess I just thought that I'd been really lucky. But the thing is, all the time, things like this kept happening to me, for good and for bad. Not every day, but these were things that atheism was having a real hard time explaining. I guess the end of the story is what I wrote about in Lucifer and the White Moths. It was over a year later when it virtually took death itself and going to the eternal fires of hell to wake me up enough to turn towards the Lord. But he, in his infinite foresight and knowledge, knew that ultimately I would make that turn to him. At the bottom of my heart, I was desperately looking for the truth and wanted to do something good with my life. I just really didn't know there was a spiritual world. So God in his love chose that day to send an angel to probably yell in my ear to get those drugs out of my apartment immediately. I just thought it was my own thoughts. Thank God for his unfathomable love and mercy and power. Well, I hope these things that I've shared here have been some kind of encouragement for you. Actually, they have been for me, just to go back and recount some of these times where the presence of God has gotten me through or out of difficult situations, often of my own making. My next reading like this will be to tell about 3 things that happened to me in Europe while I was traveling there in missionary service for the Lord. I look forward to sharing that with you soon. God bless and keep you.